Of you who follow me, you know that I talk about evolution, but I want to help you understand the difference between what I call identity, the self, and the soul. And all of those they're kind of a subtle difference, but all of those are so integrated. And yet it's really important for us to distinguish one from another because that will help you know what needs healing. And that will also help you know kind of where you are in your evolutionary process. So I'm going to just break these down a little bit. And, to me, all three of those are present at the time we're born, except that our identity is something that we really develop along the way. And that is how we know it's kind of the barometer in some ways of whether or not we know that we are growing and learning and moving beyond our stuff. So, identity. I think about identity as the process of becoming aware of your preferences, your beliefs, and your values. So think about that preferences, belief, and values. When you're first born, you don't know what those are. In fact, we are taught to follow what our culture is, or what our family culture is, or what our family beliefs are. And so there's just an assumption that we will believe what those family structures or cultural structures believe. And yet, over time, some of us may change. Some of us may change those preferences and values and beliefs according to our experiences, whether it's experiences within or experiences in interacting with the world. And if you think about your identity, it changes throughout every kind of what I call a chapter of your lifetime. Because when you're a child, again, you're just kind of being a kid, you're just following along. And you do start to understand what your preferences are at a fairly young age. So you decide a preference or you understand a preference for color or what you like to eat, what you don't like to eat, what kind of music you like to listen to, whether you prefer more being with your mother or your father, if you have a mother and father figure. um, you start to know, do you like cats or dogs? So really it's one of those things where again, I look at the identity of a person as a kind of a metamorphic kind of process because it is our job as humans to evolve, but we do that through understanding, again, what our preferences, our beliefs, and our values are. And those are, to me, those are the top three things to think about is figuring out who you are as a person. I'm going to circle back and talk about identity a little bit more in a minute. I want to talk about self. So, the sense of self is, of course, related to your identity. But again, like I said, I use the word sense, whereas the preferences, the beliefs, and the values tend to be intellectual kinds of concepts. They tend to be how you define yourself intellectually, how you would describe yourself to someone else. However, the sense of self is how you experience yourself in the process of human life, how you experience yourself as you are determining what those preferences, values, and beliefs are. Now, what I mean by that is all of us, because of how our soul is formed, we are already going to have a sense of self. We're going to have something that shows us when we feel hurt by something. There's going to be a reaction when something is not right for us. So that sense of self is partially what tells you what's aligned or misaligned within your life. And that is how you start to develop your identity as well. You sense whether or not you believe something, you sense whether or not you have a preference for something, you sense whether or not a value fits for you. And so it's more of an energetic kind of thing. It's more of an existential awareness of who you are in your evolutionary process, even if you don't use those terms. So again, the identity tends to be how we define ourselves, how we could describe ourselves through those preferences, values, beliefs. The sense of self is how we experience ourselves in the midst of developing our ideas about the preferences, beliefs, and values. And then also going back down further, the deepest level is again the soul. And when I talk about the soul is the energetic essence of who we are. And so it encompasses that process of sense of self and encompasses our identity. And when we talk about soul, this is the toughest thing. I think about how to define the soul because so many people will ask, what is the soul? How do you know you have it? How is it that you can start to understand how to feed it? All of those kinds of things. My biggest suggestion for people is to learn how to experience the soul in order to help you identify what it is for you. And the reason I mean that is I really don't think we can intellectualize the soul. I think a lot of philosophers, a lot of writers try to intellectualize it, try to define it, but they end up defining it in terms more similar to integrity and self than they do the actual experience, the spiritual, the sacredness of who that person is. And I'm going to emphasize those words, the sacredness of who a person is. The sacredness may or may not have anything to do with the sense of self because you may have those preferences, values, and beliefs that are very human. It's the sacredness, it's the energetic essence of that person that can tell you, again, when something is feeling aligned, when something is right, when something is nudging you forward. And this is where your intuition comes from. Now, I do not at all think that our intuition is our soul or our soul's voice. I think it's actually kind of the collective of spiritual voices, spiritual entities, spiritual guides, all of that included with our own soul and source. I know that can get really confusing. But it's this whole idea of if you start to think about our identity is the intellectualized version of who we are, the soul is the sense of who we are, the experience from a kind of a again an energetic existential perspective. But the soul is the core of who we are. The soul is there to push us forward to understand what we prefer, understand what our beliefs are, understand what our values are. It is also there behind the sense of self to help us develop that sense of self, to develop that consciousness and that awareness so that we can start to read the environment and see what feels safe and what doesn't feel safe. It is also, the soul is also the part of us that is behind every mind action, every behavior, every thought, every reaction. So, in other words, the soul is present from the time we're born. The sense of self develops over time, and also the identity develops over time. And the psychological world used to put the soul and the psyche in the same place, meaning they thought that it was the same thing. That's how they defined it. It is not the same. And so if I think about the psyche, it encompasses much, much more about identity and sense of self, whereas the soul, again, is that sacred nature of us, that part of us that never goes away, never dies. It's that energetic place in us, that energetic experience of who we are that goes on forever. And I don't want to kind of cross the line and talk about religion here, but it's that whole idea that no matter what happens, our soul is here to evolve beyond every human challenge we have, behind every difficulty, behind every, I don't know, roadblock that we have in life. And that is what helps us identify who we are from an identity perspective and a sense of self. But it's our soul who pushes us forward through both of those. It's our soul that wants us to prevail regardless of the knocks we take in trying to stand up for our values or trying to stand up for our beliefs or trying to stand up for our preferences. It's the part of us that pushes us forward to understand that sense of self. So they're very related concepts, very related, but they're very different concepts. And I'm trying to help people understand this because, we can lose a sense of identity and we can feel like we're losing our sense of self. But really, when we tune into that soul base, our soul still has wisdom to give us, even if we're feeling lost in life. And that is why I talk about the soul so much, is the fact that ancient cultures used to teach their young how to experience the soul. They lived and breathed through their sacredness. They lived and breathed through the sacred values, the sacred preferences, the sacred beliefs. And we have lost that along the way. Socrates, the father of medicine, I've brought this up many, many times, used to said when he was developing medicine, he used to say that basically the soul was present in every illness and in every organ. And we are not taught that anymore. We're not even taught to say the word. In fact, I've been told many times by the media, oh, don't ever use the word soul. The media doesn't want to hear the word soul. I beg to differ, and I'm going to use the word anyway, because that very energetic essence of who we are is really what pushes us through. It's what makes us prevail over every other aspect of the human condition. So again, if I was just to recap this for you, I want you to start to think about how many times do you feel like you've lost your identity throughout your lifetime because the fact that, wow, a value changed or a preference changed or a belief suddenly blew up and you have a different belief. We have to revamp, I guess I would say, and kind of re-engineer our identity many times throughout our lifetime. And yes, it still is an evolutionary process, but for the most part, once we really grasp what those preferences are, what those values are, what those beliefs are, we generally don't change them when it is a conscious process. If we blindly follow the beliefs, preferences, and values of the family or a culture or whatever, we might go through the motions, we might, go through the rituals, whatever that might be. But until we really start looking at, do those match who I am, that sense of self and that soul part of us, we might just be going through the motions. So the identity part is when it becomes conscious. This is my identity. This is who I am at this moment. This is what I believe. This is what I prefer at the moment. I say at the moment because, again, we are humans who are here to evolve. And so I think back to, I used to love actually the Catholic ritual. I grew up Catholic. There were a lot of things about the Catholic Church I didn't like. There were a lot of the beliefs that were in the church that I didn't like, but I loved the ritual. I loved the incense. I loved the singing. I actually loved the ritual of going through all of the church services. But once I started developing my own sense of self even more and my own identity more, I realized that those values did not fit me. That's what I'm saying, is think back to how many times you have had to shift your identity or had to really look at, gosh, is this who I am? Is this what I want to bring into my life? Is this what I want to participate in order for you to develop that sense of self? How is it that you got to know yourself? How is it that you took yourself forward and going, no, this is who I am. That used to be who I am. I evolved beyond that. And so who am I now? I have, a couple years ago, I was talking to a client and I said, in the middle of the session, I said to, it was a male, and I said, just when we think we know who we are, everything changes. And I hope that everything continues to change, because as we evolve, as the world evolves, we should be challenging ourselves to do that internal inventory, to check with ourselves to say, does this still fit for me? Do my preferences still fit? Do my beliefs and values still fit? How does that look now versus 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago? And things change. And so as we develop that consciousness about looking at what we believe in, what we value, all that, it does tighten up the sense of self, because then you really can't pretend if you believe something you don't, or have a value about something that you don't. So again, it starts to line up. Your sense of self starts to line up. And that's how your soul's like, oh, thank goodness we got to this next level. Oh, wow. Okay, this feels so good. Because again, as I say, the soul's most natural state is joy and contentment. If something, a value, a preference, whatever, a value is, or a belief is off kilter for us, or it has become off kilter, something inside of us is going to say, wow, I need to take a look at this. What that is inside of you is your soul's nudging of saying, yeah, let's take a look at this. Let's see if this still fits for us. Let's see how we can evolve beyond some of those things that don't feel right anymore. I know this is very confusing. I know it can be even a matter of semantics, because some people still think the self is the same thing as the soul. It is not, as far as I'm concerned. But the whole thing with it is, getting to know yourself is how you improve your soul's health. That is how you feel more fulfilled. That is how you feel more sure of what you need and what you don't need. That is how you feel, again, I use the word aligned. That is health right there, is feeling whole and aligned. But if you never get to know yourself, you're never going to get to know what it is that your identity is, and that sense of self is, and also that overall sense of your soul. Now, I can't tell you how many times I've said this, but you cannot teach the soul on paper. You have to experience the soul in order to really understand it. I can talk through this 1,000, a million times, and until you get that sense of, oh, that is my soul's voice, that is my soul's sense of what's happening here, you're probably still going to have an intellectualized version of what the soul is. I'm going to give you an example of this. I have a client who is a lawyer, and very hard worker, very, very high integrity with what she does. And, I just gently have brought in words about the soul over the few years that we've worked together, really helping her with life balance kinds of things, helping her just kind of worldly kind of understanding how things work, family stuff, all that kind of everything everybody deals with, basically. And one of the things she told me recently is that she was on a trip and she had this experience on her trip, and it was a vacation. And she said, I now understand what it means to feed my soul. I now understand what you talk about because I felt it, I experienced it, I sensed it, and I brought that back with me. And so we talked about that, how to integrate in that understanding from that experiential level so that she could use that in the future to help her understand her sense of self and when it's kind of out of balance, and also help her understand if there's something that's changing in her identity as far as her preferences, her beliefs, her values. And, as we age, we are going to change because of the fact that we go through these chapters in our lifetime. And, she's been a lawyer for many, many years. She, at some point in the next probably 5 to 10 years, will retire. We're already starting to talk a little bit about how that will change things and how that is going to shift for her and how she's going to have to understand her sense of self differently, and also how she can learn to feed her soul. Because the thing is, I tell people our heads can lead us wrong, our hearts can lead us wrong, but our soul never, ever, ever leads us wrong. And once you get into that experiential aspect, you realize that sometimes your identity tricks you to believe that you're supposed to do something that actually will misalign you. And your sense of self, of what you previously thought you were supposed to do, will again imbalance you or misalign you. And yet it's your soul's voice. It's that sense within you that says to you, gosh, something's not right here. I need to be doing something differently. That's how this is all related. But that is really the evolution of soul health, is to become more and more aware from an identity level and a sense of self level. So you can have that just moment by moment experience of, gosh, this doesn't feel right. I'm not going to do that. So then you don't wear your brain out trying to decide something. You're just getting into that soul sense. Or the same thing as if a belief no longer fits you, you don't have to go through some major grieving process. You're like, okay, it's just time to shift this. It's learning how to understand yourself at that deepest level that will create the highest and most fulfilling and most beneficial form of soul health. And that's why I talk about this so much. That's why I say, get in touch with your soul. Listen when something doesn't feel right. Learn what you're supposed to learn when something kind of throws a curveball at you, because again, your soul is trying to get your attention to evolve in some way. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this. I got into a little bit of it wasn't an argument or a debate, but a very interesting conversation with a physician a few years ago about this. Because again, he had been reading a lot of information about the self, and he was having a hard time understanding what the difference was with the self and the soul. And it's one of those things where I don't blame anybody for that, because that we have never been taught how to experience and understand our souls from a very young age. And so it's a new concept. It's something that we have to try on for size, and we have to get that sense of who we are. But just like this client of mine, using a little bit of the language, and then she understood once she experienced the depth of how nourished she felt with what she was doing on her vacation, to realize, that's it. She got it. And so I can guarantee you she'll never not know what that feels like now. And so it's really this awakening process. And I want to talk about that very briefly, that a lot of times identity crises, like, oh my gosh, I don't know who I am anymore. A lot of times those are initiators of a new awakening, a spiritual awakening, kind of really realizing, wow, there's something bigger out there. There's some other part of me that is really wanting attention here. Same thing with the sense of self. Sometimes when trauma happens, sometimes when, someone really challenges our sense of self, it could be abuse. It just could be I don't know, a comment about something. When we have something that jolts us, oftentimes, let me back up, jolts us on an identity level or a sense of self level, a lot of times that serves as an awakening to go, wait a minute, there's something deeper going on here. And then that consciousness starts to open up. So it's actually quite subtle, but it's also quite enormous if you think about it. This evolutionary path, if you were to think back to your soul path, and I just call your soul path that timeline of your life, and think about how many times you had junctures in your life when your identity shifted for some reason, or your sense of self. Maybe you woke up to your sense of self at some point. You're like, whoa, okay, wait, I deserve to be heard. I deserve to be seen. That's your sense of self. Look back to your timeline to go, wow, okay, it happened here in this age and that age and at this experience and that experience. And you're going to start to see how it all weaves together to help you understand your identity again, not to be super redundant, but your identity in terms of how did I come to have my preferences? How did I come to have my beliefs and my values? How did my identity form? And am I even aware that I have an identity? That's a good one. Second one is sense of self. When did you start to become aware of, wow, I'm separate to some extent than my family? I'm separate than my culture. I'm separate than my coworkers or my friends or even my partner or spouse. Because when you start to get that sense of self, it helps you understand how important it is to honor it. And that is probably one of the top things that I talk to people about is how to honor yourself, how to honor your soul, how to get to that deepest level of really nourishing and understanding and honoring yourself at the deepest level. Lots to talk about with this concept, but I really just want to throw this information out there to help you start thinking about the difference and how you've been evolving, even maybe without trying, and how you want to evolve, because that is the beauty of soul evolution, is that you can kind of start to see, gosh, I want to evolve beyond this reaction that I have. I want to evolve beyond this way that I've handled this all these 30, 40, 50 years. You can consciously evolve beyond, and that will help your identity change, your sense of self change, and most certainly your energetic soul change. I would love to hear your comments. I would love to hear what you have to say about this. I would love to have your questions if this is piquing questions for you, because I want to help people understand that the soul is at the core of everything that we do, everything that we are, everything that we sense and believe, and all of that. We just have to get down to that place. I joke, but I don't joke, that the only quote I ever remember writing, now I've written a lot, but the only quote I ever really verbatim remember writing is that to know your soul is to know true health, and only then can you reach radiant living. And I firmly believe that. And I firmly believe that that's what we are here to do, is to evolve and learn about ourselves. And that is our main role. People all the time want to know what their life purpose is. And the blanket statement for a lot of them is, well, for every single human on this planet, our life purpose is to get to know ourselves more. And I jokingly also say that I want to help people understand that we can be learning up until the last minute or second that we are here on this planet. I say that I want to learn even up to my last breath how to die better, if that means that I'm going to be evolving and learning. So it's one of those things where if I can learn how to die better, great, let's do it. Let's keep this conversation going. Let's keep this idea of the soul present for people, so it gets into your language, into your awareness, into kind of the essence of who you are, so that you too can learn how to recognize when something is either aligned or misaligned within all of your system, because that is the best barometer of anything for your soul's evolution. You have a wonderful day. Can't wait to hear your thoughts and questions and comments, and I will be back soon. Bye-bye.